Hi and welcome to the Archive of History. Imagine a city that existed 5,000 years ago, standing at the very threshold of human civilization. Picture vast brick temples rising above the desert plain, their sides painted in brilliant colors that caught the light of the setting sun. This was a place where writing was still a new and sacred art, where the wheel had only recently begun to transform human labor, and where the first great cities of the world were taking shape in the valley between two rivers. This was one of the most magnificent cities of ancient Mesopotamia, a place that would leave its mark on human history long after its streets fell silent and the desert sands began their patient work of burial. Before we drift off, I am always curious to know where my listeners are tuning in from and what time it is that they are listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. Tonight we will walk through those ancient streets together. We will feel the morning sun on mud brick walls, hear the calls of merchants in the marketplace, and smell the incense burning in the great temple of the moon god. We will witness the daily rhythms of a civilization that was already ancient when the pyramids of Egypt were still being built. This is not just a story of kings and conquests, though there will be both. It is the story of ordinary people living in an extraordinary time, in a city that stood at the very edge of the known world, between the fertile fields and the endless desert, between order and chaos, between the earth and the heavens. But there is another element to our story, one that gives it a haunting quality. This is also the tale of a city threatened by the very source of its life. For was built beside the great Euphrates River, and that river, like all rivers, had a will of its own. The floods that brought fertility could also bring destruction. Archaeological evidence suggests that at some point in long history, perhaps more than once, catastrophic flooding swept across the land, burying entire settlements beneath thick layers of silt. Some scholars believe these ancient memories of devastating floods may have inspired the later biblical story of Noah and the Ark, though the truth is likely more complex and more human than myth alone can capture. And so settle in now. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. The glow of screens and the hum of engines mean nothing here. We are traveling back through more than 4 millennia, to a world lit by oil lamps and starlight, where the greatest structures ever built by human hands were just beginning to reshape the landscape, and where a single city on the edge of the southern marshes was becoming the center of an entire universe. Close your eyes and breathe deeply. Our journey begins at dawn in the city of before the floods came. The land that gave birth to was unlike anywhere else on Earth. This was southern Mesopotamia, the low-lying alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a landscape that seemed to exist in a constant state of transformation. If you could have stood at the edge of the known world in the 5th millennium before the Common Era, and looked out across this territory, you would have seen something that resembled neither pure desert nor pure farmland, but rather a shimmering, uncertain boundary between water and earth. The Euphrates River, which flowed past the site where would eventually rise, was not then as it is now. Rivers in this part of the world were restless, changing their courses over centuries and sometimes over mere decades. The river braided and split, creating countless smaller channels that wound through the landscape like veins across skin. During the spring floods, when the mountain snows far to the north melted and sent their waters rushing downstream, these channels would overflow, and vast stretches of land would disappear beneath sheets of brown water. When the floods receded, they left behind a gift from the gods: rich, dark silt, the most fertile soil in the ancient world. But alongside these seasonal floods were the marshes, vast wetlands that stretched for miles in every direction. These marshes were filled with life. Dense stands of reeds grew higher than a person's head, creating a labyrinth of green walls and narrow waterways. Birds nested here by the thousands, fish swam in the shallow waters, and the reeds themselves provided the raw material for countless human needs. They could be woven into baskets and mats, bundled into columns for building, or even used to construct entire houses and boats. The marsh people, who lived in these wetlands long before cities existed, knew every secret of this landscape. They knew which plants were edible and which channels were safe to navigate. They knew the rhythms of the water and the movements of the animals. It was into this world that the first permanent settlers came. They were not the marsh people who had learned to live lightly on the land, moving with the seasons. These new arrivals were farmers, part of a culture that archaeologists now call the Ubaid people, named after a site near where their distinctive pottery was first discovered. The Ubaid settlers arrived sometime around 5000 BCE, bringing with them knowledge of agriculture and animal husbandry that had been developed further north and east. They came looking for land that could support crops, and they found it here, on slight elevations above the marshes, places where the floodwaters would recede in time for planting. These early farmers built the first structures at the site that would become Ur. Their houses were simple affairs, made from the materials the land provided. Mud was everywhere, and when mixed with straw and shaped into bricks, it became the fundamental building material of Mesopotamian civilization. These sun-dried mud bricks were not as durable as stone or fired clay, but they were abundant and easy to work with. A skilled crew could produce thousands of them in a single season. The houses built from these bricks were small and rectangular, with flat roofs made from reed bundles covered in more mud. They stayed reasonably cool in the brutal summer heat and provided adequate shelter during the rare winter rains. But the Ubaid people did not just build houses. They also built something else, something that would define this place for millennia to come. They built a temple. It was not a grand structure at first, just a modest building set apart from the others, oriented toward the cardinal directions with careful precision. This temple was dedicated to the worship of deities whose names we will never know with certainty, but what mattered was not the names but the act itself. By building a temple, these early settlers were making a statement. They were declaring that this place was special, that it was worthy of divine attention, and that the relationship between humans and gods required a permanent sacred space. Over the centuries, the settlement grew. The Ubaid period gave way to the Uruk period, named after the nearby city of Uruk, which was the first true urban center in human history. But Uruk was not far behind. As the population increased, the settlement expanded, more houses appeared, built closer together, creating the first narrow streets. The temple was rebuilt, each new version larger and more elaborate than the last. The simple pottery of the Ubaid era was replaced by more sophisticated vessels, some of them mass-produced on the newly invented potter's wheel. This was a time of rapid innovation, when humans were learning how to organize themselves in ways that had never been attempted before. And through it all, the river flowed. The Euphrates was the lifeline of Ur, providing water for drinking and irrigation, fish for food, and a highway for trade. Boats made from bundled reeds carried goods up and down the river, connecting Ur to other settlements and eventually to distant lands. But the river was also unpredictable. In some years, the floods came too early or too late, disrupting the planting season. In other years, they came with such force that they swept away entire fields and damaged the irrigation canals that farmers had laboriously dug. The people of Ur learned to live with this uncertainty, to read the subtle signs in the sky and water that might predict the river's behavior. They developed elaborate systems of canals and levees to channel the floodwaters where they were needed and keep them away from where they were not. The land itself seemed to shift and change. Silt deposited by the floods gradually raised the ground level, so that over centuries, the old Ubaid houses were buried beneath new layers of earth, and the city was rebuilt on top of itself, rising slowly higher above the surrounding plain. This created an artificial hill, or tell, which gave Ur a commanding view of the landscape. From the top of this tell, on a clear day you could see for miles in every direction. To the north and east were the fields, green with barley and wheat. To the south and west were the marshes, shimmering in the heat, and beyond them the distant desert. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, around 2900, Ur had become a proper city. It had a population of several thousand people, perhaps as many as 10,000 at its peak. It had monumental architecture, including the great temple precinct that dominated the center of the city. It had craft specialists who worked in copper and bronze, producing tools and weapons of unprecedented sophistication. It had merchants who traveled to distant lands, bringing back exotic goods like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan and carnelian from the Indus Valley. And it had scribes, literate individuals who were mastering the new art of writing, using wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft clay to record transactions, compose hymns, and preserve the knowledge of their civilization. This was the world into which you would have been born, if you had lived in Ur during its early flourishing. This was the landscape that shaped every aspect of your existence, from the food you ate to the gods you worshipped. The river gave you life, but it could also take it away. The land was fertile, but only if you worked it with skill and care. The city was a place of opportunity, but also of hierarchy and obligation, and everywhere always, There was the sense that you were living at a pivotal moment in human history, when the old ways of the village and the marsh were giving way to something new and grand and possibly eternal. The city of Ur, standing between the water and the desert, was becoming the center of the world. You wake before sunrise, as everyone does. Sleep has left you gradually, pulled away by the subtle sounds of the household stirring and the quality of the light seeping through the small window high in the mud brick wall. The room where you sleep is modest, perhaps 10 feet by 12, with walls that have been smoothed and plastered, then whitewashed with a thin coating of gypsum. The floor beneath you is packed earth, worn smooth by years of footsteps. Your sleeping mat is woven from reed fibers, and your blanket, necessary despite the warmth of the season, is made from wool. Both will be rolled up and stored in a corner once you rise. The house is built around a central courtyard, open to the sky. This is where the family spends most of its time during the day, and where much of the household work takes place. You can hear your mother already moving in the courtyard, preparing the morning meal. The soft scrape of a grinding stone tells you she is working barley into flour. This sound is one of the fundamental rhythms of life in Ur, heard in every household before dawn, the steady back and forth motion of the upper stone against the lower, crushing the hard kernels into fine powder that will be mixed with water and baked into flat bread on a clay oven. You rise and stretch, feeling the stiffness in your muscles from yesterday's labor. You are perhaps 16 or 17 years old enough to do a full day's work, but not yet married, not yet the head of your own household. Your father is a craftsman, a maker of pottery, which means your family occupies a respectable if not exalted position in the city's social hierarchy. You are not wealthy enough to own slaves, but you are far from the poorest families who work in the fields from dawn to dusk for barely enough to eat. In the corner of the sleeping room stands a small ceramic shrine. It holds a figurine of a household deity, a protective spirit whose exact identity is known only to your family. Each morning, before anything else, you whisper a brief prayer and leave a small offering, perhaps a few drops of beer or a pinch of incense. This is not grand theology, but simple household religion, the acknowledgement that unseen forces watch over the family and must be respected and appeased. You step out into the courtyard, where the sky is beginning to lighten from black to deep blue. Stars are still visible, though they fade even as you watch. The air is cool now, pleasant, but you know that within a few hours the heat will become oppressive, driving everyone to seek shade and stillness during the worst of the afternoon. Your mother nods to you as you appear, and your younger sister, perhaps 12 years old, is tending the fire beneath the clay oven, carefully feeding it dried reeds and sheep dung, which burns slow and hot. There is a water jar in the corner of the courtyard, made of fired clay, its surface still cool from the night. You dip a small cup into it and drink deeply. The water has a slightly muddy taste, as it always does, drawn from the canal that runs along the edge of the neighborhood. It is not as clean as you might wish, but it is what you have. Wealthy households employ servants to carry water from better sources, but your family makes do with what is nearby. Your father emerges from another room, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. He is a compact man, with strong hands and forearms developed from years of working clay. His face is weathered from the sun, and his dark beard is streaked with gray. He says little in the mornings, preferring to ease into the day rather than rush. He takes his cup of water, drinks, and then splashes a little on his face and neck, shaking off the droplets like a dog. The morning meal is simple. Flat bread, still warm from the oven, served with a paste made from ground chickpeas and a little oil. There is also a small dish of dates, wrinkled and intensely sweet, and more of the weak beer that is the standard beverage of the city. You eat with your fingers, sitting on a low stool in the courtyard, watching as the sky continues to lighten and the first calls of the street vendors begin to echo from nearby lanes. When the meal is finished, you prepare to leave the house. Your father is heading to his workshop, which occupies a small building adjacent to the family home. You, however, have other work today. A wealthy merchant has commissioned your father to produce a set of fine serving vessels, and you have been sent to the marketplace to purchase the specific pigments needed for decoration. This means you will spend the morning walking through the city, and the thought pleases you. Ur is a place of constant activity and endless variety, and you never tire of observing the life of the streets. You step through the low doorway that leads from the courtyard to the street. The door itself is made from wood, a valuable commodity in a land where trees are scarce. It hangs on leather hinges and can be barred from the inside at night. The street outside is narrow, barely wide enough for two people to pass each other comfortably. The houses on either side lean close, their upper stories nearly touching, creating a tunnel-like effect that provides welcome shade. The street is unpaved, just packed earth worn smooth by countless feet. It curves and winds, following no obvious plan, the result of centuries of organic growth rather than any master design. There are no street names, no addresses, as you would understand them. People know where they are going by landmarks, by the houses of prominent families, by the location of shrines and workshops. You begin to walk, heading generally toward the center of the city. The morning is still quiet, but already there are signs of activity. A door opens, and a woman steps out, carrying a large ceramic jug on her shoulder, heading to the canal for water. Two young boys run past, laughing, chasing a hoop made from reeds. An old man sits in a doorway, already awake, watching the street with rheumy eyes. You nod to him respectfully as you pass, and he raises a hand in acknowledgement. The smell of the city is strong in the morning. There is the pleasant scent of baking bread from a dozen different households, mingled with less pleasant odors. Sewage and refuse are thrown into the street or into open pits, and while the sun and dry air help to bake everything into relative harmlessness, the smell is always present, a sour undertone to the life of the city. You are so accustomed to it that you barely notice, but visitors from the countryside often complain. As you walk, the streets begin to widen and straighten. You are entering one of the more prosperous neighborhoods, where the houses are larger and better maintained. Some have 2 stories, with upper rooms that jut out over the street, supported by wooden beams. The walls here are often decorated with geometric patterns pressed into the mud plaster while it was still wet, creating a textured surface that catches the light. You pass a small shrine built into a niche in a wall. It holds a small clay figure of a deity, perhaps Nana Sin, the moon god who is the patron of Ur, or perhaps one of the lesser gods who watch over specific neighborhoods and activities. Someone has left fresh flowers already wilting in the heat, and a small cup of beer. You pause and bow your head briefly, adding your silent respect to the offerings. The streets are growing busier. You see a merchant leading a donkey loaded with bundles of goods, heading toward the marketplace. You see a group of workers carrying baskets of bricks, likely heading to a construction site somewhere in the city. You see a priest, identifiable by his long white robe and shaved head, walking with measured steps, his eyes focused on the middle distance, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. And then, turning a corner, you see it. Rising above the rooftops, dominating the entire city, is the Great Ziggurat of Ur. It is a mountain of brick, a stepped pyramid painted in brilliant colors, ascending in 3 great terraces toward the sky. At the very top, barely visible from where you stand, is the temple sanctuary, the house of the god, where Nana Sin himself is said to dwell when he visits the earth. The sight of the ziggurat fills you with a complex mixture of emotions, pride that your city possesses such a magnificent structure, awe at the power of the god and the kings who built this monument, and perhaps a small thread of fear, for the gods are not to be taken lightly. You continue walking, drawn toward the ziggurat, even though the marketplace is in a different direction. The great temple precinct, which surrounds the ziggurat, is the sacred heart of Ur, and you feel compelled to pass near it, even if you cannot enter. The streets here are wider, more formal, leading to the massive gates that control access to the sacred precinct. Guards stand at these gates, armed with bronze-tipped spears, ensuring that only authorized individuals, priests and temple officials, and those with business in the sacred area are allowed to pass. You do not approach the gates, but instead turn and follow the outer wall of the precinct. This wall is itself impressive, built from baked bricks rather than the sun-dried variety used in most construction. Baked bricks are more expensive, requiring enormous quantities of fuel to fire them in kilns, but they are also far more durable, resistant to the erosive effects of water and wind. The wall stands perhaps 20 feet high, and its top is crenellated, giving it the appearance of a fortress as much as a religious structure. As you walk along the wall, you can hear sounds from within the precinct, the chanting of priests performing the morning rituals, the lowing of cattle being led to sacrifice, the clatter of construction as workmen continue the endless task of maintaining and expanding the sacred buildings. The temple precinct is not just a place of worship, It is also an economic institution, controlling vast amounts of land and employing hundreds of workers. The priests who serve here are among the most powerful individuals in the city, second only to the king himself. Eventually, you reach the marketplace, which occupies a large open area not far from the temple precinct. Here, the orderly streets give way to a chaotic sprawl of stalls and booths, some permanent structures, others little more than reed mats spread on the ground with goods displayed on them. The noise is overwhelming after the relative quiet of the residential streets. Vendors call out, advertising their wares. Customers haggle loudly over prices. Animals bleat and bray. Children run between the stalls, playing games or begging for scraps. You make your way through the crowd, looking for the stall of the pigment seller. The marketplace is organized by trade, with all the sellers of similar goods clustered together, and you know where to look. You pass the food vendors first, selling fresh fish from the river, cuts of mutton, piles of barley and wheat, baskets of dates and figs and onions. The smell here is strong, a mixture of fresh produce and the slightly rank odor of meat sitting too long in the heat. Next come the cloth merchants, displaying bolts of wool and linen in various qualities. Some of the fabric is undyed, a natural creamy white or grey, but others have been dyed in bright colors, red from madder root, yellow from saffron, blue from woad. The finest fabrics, likely imported from distant lands, are kept under cover, brought out only for serious customers who can afford such luxuries. You pass stalls selling pottery, some of it fine ware with intricate painted designs, other pieces crude and utilitarian. You pass metal workers displaying bronze tools and weapons, their surfaces gleaming in the morning sun. You pass jewelers offering beads of carnelian and lapis lazuli, materials that have traveled thousands of miles to end up here, in this marketplace in the heart of Mesopotamia. Finally, you find the pigment seller. He is an old man with stained fingers, sitting cross-legged behind an array of small ceramic jars and leather pouches. Each container holds a different color: red ochre, yellow ochre, ground malachite for green, crushed azurite for blue, black soot, white gypsum. You explain what you need, and he nods, measuring out small quantities into a leather pouch and naming his price. You haggle briefly, more out of custom than any real desire to lower the price significantly, and then you pay him in small pieces of silver, carefully weighed on a balanced scale to ensure accuracy. With your purchase complete, you begin the walk back to your father's workshop. The sun is fully up now, and the heat is building. The streets are at their busiest, filled with people conducting the business of the day. You pass workers, merchants, priests, slaves, children, the entire spectrum of urban life flowing around you like a river, and everywhere over it all stands the great ziggurat, a reminder of the divine order that underlies and legitimates the human order of the city. You are home by mid-morning, handing the pigments to your father, who nods his approval. The rest of your day will be spent in the workshop preparing clay, shaping vessels on the potter's wheel, tending the kiln. It is hard work, but it is also skilled work, and you take pride in it. You are part of a civilization that has learned to transform raw earth into objects of beauty and utility. You are living in a city that has endured for centuries and will, you believe, endure for centuries more. You are a citizen of Ur, and that identity, that connection to this place and its people and its gods defines who you are. The ziggurat of Ur was not merely a building. It was a statement written in brick and bitumen, a physical manifestation of the relationship between heaven and earth, between the divine realm of the gods and the mortal realm of humanity. To understand Ur, you must understand the ziggurat, for it was the axis around which the entire city revolved, the heart that pumped life through every street and neighborhood. The ziggurat rose in 3 great terraces, each one smaller than the one below, creating a stepped pyramid that climbed more than 60 feet into the sky. The lowest terrace was massive, its base measuring roughly 200 feet by 150 feet, built from millions of mud bricks. These bricks had been made by hand, molded from clay and straw, dried in the fierce Mesopotamian sun, and then laid one upon another in courses that were bonded with bitumen, the black sticky substance that oozed from the ground in certain places and served as an ancient form of cement. But not all of the ziggurat was made from sun-dried brick. The outer facing of the structure, visible to all who approached, was constructed from far more expensive baked bricks. These had been fired in huge kilns, a process that consumed enormous quantities of fuel, usually reeds or sheep dung, and produced a material that was nearly as hard as stone and far more resistant to the elements. The baked brick surface of the ziggurat was further protected by a coating of bitumen, and then in some sections, decorated with glazed ceramic cones pressed into the bitumen to create colorful geometric patterns. The colors of the ziggurat were striking. The lowest terrace was painted black, representing the underworld, the realm of earth and darkness. The middle terrace was red, symbolizing the earth itself, the realm of human existence. The highest terrace, where the actual temple sanctuary stood, was painted white or covered with sheets of beaten silver, representing the heavens, the realm of the gods. As the sun moved across the sky, the ziggurat seemed to change and shimmer, the white top blazing like fire in the afternoon light, the red and black below creating a solid base that anchored the structure to the earth. Access to the ziggurat was controlled and limited. There was no single grand staircase leading from the base to the top. Instead, 3 separate staircases, one on each side, led to the first terrace. 2 of these staircases ran perpendicular to the wall, climbing steeply up the face of the structure. The third ran parallel to the northeastern wall, rising at a gentler angle. All 3 converged at a monumental gateway on the first terrace, a point of transition where those privileged to ascend further would pause and purify themselves before continuing. From the first terrace, another staircase led to the second, and from there, a final staircase climbed to the summit. These upper staircases were narrower, more exclusive, and only the priests and the king, and perhaps a handful of high officials ever walked them. The climb was deliberate and ritualistic, each step a movement from the profane world of the city below toward the sacred space of the god above. At the very top of the ziggurat stood the temple sanctuary, a small building compared to the massive bulk of the structure beneath it, but the most important building in all of Ur. This was the Djipar, the house of the god Nana Sin. The temple itself was built from baked brick and roofed with timbers imported from distant forests, an extraordinary expense in a land where wood was scarce. The interior was a series of small rooms, including an inner sanctum where the cult statue of Nana Sin resided. This statue was not merely a representation of the god. In the theology of ancient Mesopotamia, it was, in a very real sense, the god himself, or at least the physical vessel through which the god could interact with the human world. The statue was carved from precious wood and covered with sheets of gold and silver. Its eyes were inlaid with lapis lazuli and shell, giving it an eerily lifelike appearance. It was dressed in fine garments that were changed regularly, and it was anointed with perfumed oils. It was, in essence, treated as a living being, because in the minds of the people of Ur that is exactly what it was. Nana Sin was the moon god, the patron deity of Ur, and his importance to the city cannot be overstated. The moon, in Mesopotamian cosmology, was not merely a celestial body, but a deity in its own right, traversing the night sky in a boat, bringing light to the darkness, measuring time with its regular phases. The monthly cycle of the moon, from new moon to full moon and back again, provided the basis for the Mesopotamian calendar. Each month began with the sighting of the first crescent moon, after the dark of the moon, and this moment was celebrated with festivals and offerings. Nana Sin was seen as a wise and beneficent deity, associated with fertility, wisdom and justice. He was often depicted as an elderly man with a long beard, wearing a horned cap that signified his divine status. He was said to ride across the night sky in a boat shaped like a crescent moon, accompanied by his wife, the goddess Ningal, and surrounded by stars that were themselves lesser deities. The moon's light was seen as his blessing on the land, and eclipses were terrifying events that suggested the god was angry or under attack by demons. The worship of Nana Sin was a daily affair. Each morning before dawn, the priests of the temple would rise and begin the first of several ritual meals that would be offered to the god throughout the day. The statue of Nana Sin would be awakened with prayers and hymns. It would be washed, dressed in fresh garments, and seated at a table laden with food. This was not symbolic food, but real food: bread, beer, meat, fruit, vegetables, all of the finest quality. The food would be left before the statue for a prescribed period, during which time it was believed that the god consumed the spiritual essence of the offerings. Afterward, the physical food would be removed and distributed among the priests and temple workers, who would eat it as a form of sacred communion with the deity. This ritual was repeated at midday and again in the evening. The evening meal was the most elaborate, accompanied by music and incense. Musicians would play lyres and drums, filling the sanctuary with sound, while censers burned aromatic resins imported from distant lands, creating clouds of fragrant smoke that were believed to be pleasing to the gods. The priests would chant hymns in Sumerian, the sacred language of religious ritual, even though by this period many of them spoke Akkadian in their daily lives. On the first day of each month, when the new crescent moon appeared, the rituals became even more elaborate. Processions would wind through the sacred precinct, and sometimes through the streets of the city. The king himself, if he was in residence in Ur, would participate, for in Mesopotamian theology, the king was the earthly representative of the gods, chosen by them to rule over humanity. The king would climb the ziggurat and enter the sanctuary, standing before the statue of Nana Sin to offer prayers and sacrifices on behalf of the entire city. There were also great annual festivals, tied to the agricultural calendar and the movements of the celestial bodies. The most important of these was the Akitu festival, the New Year celebration, which lasted for 12 days and involved ritual dramas reenacting the creation of the world and the triumph of order over chaos. During this festival, the statue of Nana Sin would be carried from the ziggurat to a special temple outside the city walls, where further rituals would take place before the god was returned in triumph to his sacred home. The ziggurat was also a statement of royal power. It had been built by kings, using the labor of thousands, as a way of demonstrating their piety and their ability to command vast resources. The construction of the ziggurat, as it stood in the later periods of Ur's history, was primarily the work of Ur-Nammu, the founder of the third dynasty of Ur, who ruled around 2100 BCE. Ur-Nammu was a great builder, and the ziggurat was his masterpiece, a monument that would endure long after his death and cement his reputation as one of the greatest kings of Mesopotamian history. But the ziggurat was not just about power and politics. For the ordinary people of Ur, who could never climb its steps or enter its sanctuary, the ziggurat was a source of comfort and identity. It was a physical reminder that the gods had chosen Ur as their dwelling place on earth, that the city was under divine protection. When you looked up at the ziggurat from the streets below, you were reminded of your place in a cosmic order that extended from the lowest slave to the highest god. You were part of something larger than yourself, a civilization that had endured for generations and would, with the god's favor, endure for generations more. The ziggurat was the mountain of God in a land without mountains. It was the place where heaven and earth touched, where prayers ascended and blessings descended. It was built from mud, that most humble of materials, transformed through human labor and divine will into something magnificent and eternal. And as long as the ziggurat stood, the city of Ur stood with it, secure in the knowledge that Nana Sin watched over his people from his high throne, measuring their days by the cycles of his celestial journey. The foundation of the economy was agriculture. Though Ur was an urban center, it was intimately connected to the surrounding countryside, where fields of barley and wheat stretched for miles, tended by farmers who lived in small villages, or who commuted daily from the city itself. These farmers rose before dawn, and worked until the heat of midday forced them to rest. They would resume in the late afternoon, working until the last light faded from the sky. The agricultural calendar was dictated by the rhythm of the river. In the spring, when the Euphrates flooded, carrying snowmelt from the mountains far to the north, the fields would be inundated with water and silt. When the floods receded, the farmers would plant their crops, working the still damp soil with wooden plows pulled by oxen. Barley was the staple crop, more tolerant of the salty soil than wheat, and able to produce a good harvest even in difficult conditions. Wheat was also grown, but it required better soil and more careful management. The fields had to be irrigated, for the rainfall in southern Mesopotamia was sparse and unreliable. The farmers dug networks of canals and ditches, diverting water from the main channel of the river and distributing it across the fields. This required constant maintenance. Canals would silt up and have to be cleared. Levees would breach and have to be repaired. The organization of irrigation was a communal effort, overseen by officials who ensured that water was distributed fairly and that the system as a whole functioned efficiently. Harvest time was a period of intense activity. The barley would be cut with bronze sickles, bundled and carried to threshing floors, where it would be beaten to separate the grain from the chaff. The grain would then be winnowed, tossed into the air so that the wind could carry away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain fell to the ground. Finally, it would be stored in large ceramic jars or in granaries, ready to be distributed throughout the year. But agriculture was just one part of the economy. Dar was also a city of craftsmen, individuals who had mastered specialized skills and who produced goods that were traded locally and across vast distances. The potters were among the most important of these craftsmen. Pottery was essential to daily life, used for cooking, storage, serving food, and even for record keeping, since clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform writing were the primary medium for written communication. A potter's workshop was a place of controlled chaos. Clay would be brought in from pits near the river, raw and full of impurities. It would be soaked in water mixed with sand or crushed pottery to give it the proper texture, and then wedged and kneaded to remove air bubbles. The potter would then sit at a wheel, a horizontal disc that could be spun by kicking a lower disc with one foot, and would shape the clay into vessels with practiced hands. It took years to master this skill, to develop the touch that could transform a lump of clay into a perfectly symmetrical bowl or jar. Once the vessels were shaped, they would be left to dry until they were leather hard, at which point they might be decorated. Some pottery was left plain, but finer pieces would be painted with geometric designs or images of animals and plants, using slips made from refined clay mixed with mineral pigments. The painted vessels would then be fired in a kiln, a domed structure built from bricks and fed with fuel until the interior reached temperatures high enough to vitrify the clay and set the paint. Metalworking was another crucial craft. Copper had been worked in Mesopotamia for thousands of years, but by the time of Ur's greatness, it had been largely superseded by bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that was harder and more durable. Bronze weapons, tools, and ornaments were highly valued, and the smiths who produced them were respected members of society. A metalworker's shop was hot and loud. The furnace would be stoked with charcoal, and bellows made from leather would pump air into the fire to raise the temperature. The copper and tin would be melted together in a crucible, and the molten bronze would be poured into molds carved from stone or formed from clay. Swords, daggers, spear points, axes, chisels, needles, pins, and countless other objects would emerge from these molds, rough and ready for finishing. The smith would hammer and file and polish the bronze, transforming raw castings into finished products. Some of the bronze was decorated with elaborate designs, inlaid with silver or gold, or engraved with images and inscriptions. The finest pieces were works of art as much as functional objects, and they were commissioned by wealthy patrons, kings and priests and merchants who could afford such luxuries. Jewelry was another specialized craft, and Ur was particularly famous for its jewelers. The royal tombs excavated by archaeologists in the 20th century revealed the extraordinary skill of these ancient craftsmen. Gold was worked into sheets so thin they were almost translucent, then shaped into crowns and necklaces and earrings. Beads of lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone imported from Afghanistan, were cut and polished and strung into intricate patterns. Carnelian, a red stone from India, was similarly worked, as was shell and mother of pearl. The jewelers of Ur understood the properties of these materials intimately, knowing how to cut and drill and polish each one to bring out its natural beauty. Textiles were another major industry. Wool from sheep was the primary fiber, though linen made from flax was also used, particularly for finer garments. The process of turning raw wool into finished cloth was long and labor-intensive. First, the wool had to be cleaned, washed repeatedly to remove dirt and grease. Then it was combed to align the fibers and remove tangles. Next came spinning, the process of twisting the fibers into thread, done with a simple spindle, a weighted stick that was spun between the fingers while the thread was drawn out. Spinning was typically women's work, something that could be done while tending children or engaging in conversation, and nearly every household would have had a woman sitting with a spindle, adding to the family's supply of thread. The thread would then be woven into cloth, on a loom. The simplest looms were just wooden frames with the warp threads stretched vertically and weighted with stones at the bottom. The weaver would pass the weft thread horizontally through the warp, creating the fabric. More complex looms could produce intricate patterns, and woven textiles from Ur prized trade goods, exported to distant lands. The finished cloth could be dyed, though undyed wool in its natural shades of white, grey, and brown was also common. The dyes came from plants and minerals, madder root for red, woad for blue, saffron for yellow. The cloth would be soaked in vats of dye, then hung to dry, and the process might be repeated multiple times to achieve the desired depth of color. Scribes occupied a unique and privileged position in the social hierarchy of Literacy was rare, and those who possessed it wielded significant power. Scribes were trained in special schools, beginning their education as young children and spending years learning to read and write the complex cuneiform script. They practiced by copying standard texts, literary works, and legal documents over and over until their handwriting was clear and their knowledge of the written language complete. Once trained, a scribe might find employment in many different contexts. Some worked in the temples, keeping records of offerings and temple property. Others worked for merchants, recording transactions and composing contracts. Still others were employed by the palace, handling the vast administrative apparatus of the state. And some scribes were scholars, dedicating themselves to the composition of literary works, hymns, myths, and wisdom literature. The work of the scribe was done with a reed stylus, a cut reed with a triangular tip that would be pressed into soft clay tablets to create the wedge-shaped marks that make up cuneiform writing. A skilled scribe could write quickly and clearly, producing documents that were both legible and beautiful. When a document was complete, the clay tablet would be left to dry, creating a permanent record. Important documents might be fired in a kiln to make them even more durable. All of this work, from farming to scribing, was organized within a complex economic system. Some workers were free, owning their own land or workshops and working for their own benefit. Others were dependent laborers, working for the temple or the palace, or wealthy private individuals in exchange for rations. And some were slaves, individuals who had been captured in war or who had sold themselves or their children into bondage to pay off debts. The temple and palace institutions controlled vast amounts of land and employed thousands of workers. These institutions operated like large corporations with detailed record-keeping and hierarchical management. Workers would be issued rations of barley, oil, and wool, the basic necessities of life, in exchange for their labor. The rations were carefully calculated based on the worker's status and the nature of their work. A field laborer might receive a fixed amount of barley per month, enough to sustain an individual but not generous. A skilled craftsman would receive more, reflecting the greater value of their labor. This institutional economy coexisted with a market economy where goods were bought and sold. The marketplace of was a bustling center of trade, where merchants offered goods from near and far, and where prices were determined by negotiation and the forces of supply and demand. Silver was used as a standard of value, though actual coinage would not be invented for another millennium. Instead, silver was weighed out in small pieces, with standardized weights ensuring fairness in transactions. Trade extended far beyond the city walls. Merchants organized caravans of donkeys, loading them with goods produced in textiles, pottery, metalwork, and setting out across the desert or down the river to trade with distant cities. They would return with goods not available locally: timber from the forests of Lebanon, copper from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, precious stones and exotic materials that fed the luxury markets of This trade was risky, and merchants often formed partnerships to spread the risk and pool resources. Contracts would be drawn up, recorded on clay tablets, specifying the terms of the partnership, how profits would be divided, and what would happen in case of loss. These contracts show a sophisticated understanding of business and law, a recognition that trade requires trust and that trust requires enforcement mechanisms. The work of in all its variety, was what made the city function. It was what turned the agricultural surplus of the countryside into the material culture of urban civilization. It was what connected to the wider world, bringing in exotic goods and sending out the products of Mesopotamian craftsmanship. And it was what gave meaning and structure to the lives of the city's inhabitants. For work was not just a means of survival, but also a source of identity and social standing. You were defined by what you did, by your skill and your contribution to the collective life of the city. And in a place like where the divine and human realms were so closely intertwined, even the most mundane work could be seen as serving the gods. Death was a constant presence in the ancient world, and the people of faced it with a mixture of resignation and elaborate ritual. The dead were not simply discarded, but were honored and remembered, their journey to the underworld marked by ceremonies and offerings. And in the case of royalty and the highest elites, death became the occasion for displays of wealth and power that would remain buried for millennia, waiting to astonish future generations. The Royal Cemetery of Ur is one of the most famous archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, excavated by the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley in the 1920s. What Woolley found beneath the accumulated debris of millennia was extraordinary. A series of tombs dating to around 2600 BCE, the early dynastic period, containing the remains of kings and queens and their attendants, along with treasures of unimaginable richness. But before we descend into those tombs, we must first understand the ordinary burial practices of Ur, for even common people were buried with care and ceremony. When someone died, the body would be washed and wrapped in cloth or reed matting. The deceased would be buried beneath the floor of their own house, a practice that kept the family close even in death. The body would be placed in a shallow grave along with a few personal possessions, pottery vessels containing food and drink for the journey to the underworld, perhaps a favorite cup or a piece of jewelry, tools if the deceased had been a craftsman. The Mesopotamian conception of the afterlife was not a pleasant one. The underworld, called Kurd in Sumerian, was imagined as a dark, dusty place beneath the earth, a land of shadows where the dead existed in a pale imitation of life. There was no reward or punishment in this afterlife, no heaven or hell, just an eternal continuation of a diminished existence. The dead were called the ones who dwell in dust, and their sustenance came from the offerings made by the living. If the family continued to bring food and drink to the grave, the spirit of the deceased would be nourished. If the offerings ceased, the spirit would suffer, wandering restlessly and possibly returning to haunt the living. This understanding of death made funerary rituals essential. Regular offerings at the grave were a way of maintaining the bond between the living and the dead, of ensuring that the family remained whole even across the boundary of death. These offerings might be made on anniversaries or festival days, times when the entire city would be engaged in honoring the dead. But the royal burials discovered by Woolley were something else entirely. These were not simple graves beneath house floors, but elaborate tomb structures built of brick, with vaulted roofs and multiple chambers. The principal burial chamber would contain the body of the king or queen, placed in a wooden coffin or sometimes in a sarcophagus made of stone. The body was adorned with gold and silver jewelry, wearing a crown or headdress of extraordinary craftsmanship. In one tomb, that of Queen Puabi, the skull of the deceased wore a magnificent headdress made from gold, lapis lazuli, and carnelian, fashioned into the shape of leaves and flowers. A piece so delicate and beautiful that it remains one of the treasures of the British Museum. But the most disturbing aspect of these royal tombs was what archaeologists came to call the death pits. Adjacent to the main burial chamber were large open areas containing the bodies of dozens of individuals, all of whom appeared to have died at the same time and been buried in the same ceremony. These were the attendants of the king or queen, and they had been sacrificed to accompany their ruler into the afterlife. The arrangement of the bodies in these death pits suggests a highly orchestrated event. The attendants were dressed in their finest clothes and adorned with jewelry. They were arranged in rows, often holding musical instruments or weapons, as if they had been performing their duties at the moment of death. Skeletal analysis shows no signs of violence, no broken bones or cut marks, suggesting that they died peacefully, possibly from poison administered as part of the funeral ceremony. We can only imagine the scene. The tomb chamber is prepared, the body of the king or queen placed within, surrounded by treasures, chests of gold and silver, weapons inlaid with precious stones, furniture decorated with mosaics of shell and lapis lazuli. Then the attendants descend into the pit, 60 or 70 individuals, soldiers and musicians and servants, all dressed in ceremonial finery. They arrange themselves according to some predetermined plan, and then perhaps after drinking a drugged cup of wine or beer, they lie down and wait for death. The tomb is sealed, earth is piled over it, and the funeral is complete. The king or queen has departed for the underworld, accompanied by an entire court, ready to continue the life of luxury and power they enjoyed on earth. This practice of human sacrifice associated with royal burials appears to have been relatively short-lived in Mesopotamian history, limited to a specific period in the early dynastic age. It was not practiced in later periods, and even in its own time. It may have been limited to the most powerful rulers, but its existence tells us something important about the beliefs and values of the people of Ur during this era. It speaks to a conception of kingship in which the ruler was seen as semi-divine, so elevated above ordinary humanity that even death did not diminish their need for service. It also speaks to a worldview in which the bonds of loyalty and duty extended beyond the grave, where to serve one's lord in death was seen as the ultimate honor. The grave goods found in these tombs were spectacular. There were lyres with sound boxes decorated with inlaid images of animals and mythological scenes. There were gaming boards with playing pieces of shell and lapis. There were weapons, daggers, and spearheads of bronze and gold. There were vessels of gold and silver, bowls and cups and jars, some decorated with repoussé work showing scenes of feasting and ritual. There were headdresses and jewelry of such delicacy that modern jewelers marvel at the skill required to create them. One particularly striking object was the so-called ram in the thicket, a small sculptural piece showing a ram standing on its hind legs, caught in the branches of a stylized tree. The ram's body was made from gold and lapis, and the tree was decorated with shell and gold leaves. The piece was probably a stand for a small bowl or cup, but it was also a work of art, imbued with symbolic meaning. The ram caught in the thicket may have been a reference to the practice of animal sacrifice, or it may have had some mythological significance now lost to us. These objects were not made for the tomb. They were objects that had been used in life, part of the daily or ceremonial life of the palace, and they were buried because the dead ruler would need them in the afterlife. This practice of burying the dead with their possessions was common across many cultures, but the scale and richness of the burials was unusual even in the ancient world. For the ordinary people of these royal funerals must have been awe-inspiring events. The death of a king or queen was not just a personal loss but a cosmic disruption, a moment when the ordered structure of society was threatened. The funeral rituals, with their elaborate ceremonies and dramatic sacrifices, were a way of reaffirming order, of ensuring that the transition of power from one ruler to the next was smooth and divinely sanctioned. But royal death also meant opportunity for the living. A new king would often celebrate his accession with building projects and generous donations to temples, acts designed to secure divine favor and popular support. The craftsmen and merchants who had supplied goods for the royal funeral would be well compensated, and there might be a general distribution of rations or a remission of taxes, a way of sharing the wealth of the palace with the city at large. The underworld itself was ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal, the queen of the dead, and her consort Nergal. These deities were feared rather than loved, for they presided over a realm from which there was no return. The myths of Mesopotamia told of heroes who attempted to journey to the underworld and return, most famously the goddess Inanna, who descended to the realm of her sister Ereshkigal and was trapped there until rescued. These stories emphasized the finality of death and the danger of attempting to transgress its boundaries. Yet there was also a recognition that death was a natural part of the cycle of existence. The dead nourished the earth, their bodies returning to the soil, and from that soil, new life would grow. The fields that fed the city of were fertilized, not just by river silt, but by the accumulated remains of generations. A thought that was perhaps comforting in its way, a reminder that even in death you continued to serve the community. The royal cemetery of with its treasures and its mysteries, remains one of the most enigmatic aspects of the city's history. Why did this practice of elaborate royal burial with human sacrifice begin, and why did it end? What did the attendants think as they descended into the death pit? Were they willing participants, seeing their sacrifice as a duty and an honor, or were they coerced, their compliance secured by religious authority and social pressure? We cannot know for certain. The clay tablets of tell us much about daily life, about trade and law and administration, but they are largely silent on matters of personal belief and emotional experience. What we can say is that the burials reveal a society that invested enormous resources in honoring its dead, particularly its royal dead. They reveal a belief in an afterlife that, while not pleasant, was real and required preparation. And they reveal a level of craftsmanship and artistry that speaks to a civilization at the height of its powers, confident in its wealth and its ability to command both the labor of the living and the loyalty of the dead. Around the year 2112 BCE, a new dynasty rose to power in and the city entered what historians now call its Golden Age. This was the third dynasty of often abbreviated as Ur-Thi, and it would last for just over a century, from approximately 2112 to 2004 BCE. During this period, was not merely a city, but the capital of an empire that controlled much of southern Mesopotamia and exerted influence far beyond. The founder of this dynasty was a man named Ur-Nammu. and he would become one of the most celebrated kings in Mesopotamian history. Ur-Nammu rose to power in a time of political fragmentation. The Akkadian Empire, which had briefly united Mesopotamia under a series of powerful rulers, had collapsed, and the region had fractured into competing city-states. Ur-Nammu emerged as the Ensi, or governor, of Ur, but he quickly asserted his independence and began a campaign of conquest and consolidation. Ur-Nammu's achievements were many, but two stand out above all others: his building projects and his law code. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, which we have already explored, was his creation, or at least was rebuilt and expanded to its greatest extent under his reign. This was not just an act of piety, but a statement of royal power and divine favor. By building a new house for the moon god Nana Sin, Ur-Nammu was asserting that he had been chosen by the gods to rule, and that his rule would bring prosperity and order. But Ur-Nammu did not stop with the ziggurat. He embarked on an ambitious program of temple construction and repair throughout his realm. Old temples that had fallen into disrepair were restored. New temples were built in cities that had recently come under his control. These projects served multiple purposes. They demonstrated the king's wealth and his ability to command vast resources. They reinforced his claim to divine legitimacy, and they created employment for thousands of workers, binding the populace to the throne through economic dependency. Ur-Nammu also undertook massive infrastructure projects. He ordered the construction and repair of irrigation canals, ensuring that the fields would be well watered and productive. He built defensive walls around cities, protecting his subjects from external threats. He constructed roads and way stations, facilitating trade and communication across his empire. These were not glamorous projects like temples, but they were essential to the functioning of the state, and they would have been noticed and appreciated by ordinary people whose lives were made more secure and prosperous as a result. But perhaps Ur-Nammu's most enduring legacy was his law code, the Code of Ur-Nammu. This was not the oldest law code in Mesopotamia, but it is the oldest that has survived in a form complete enough to be studied, and it predates the more famous Code of Hammurabi by nearly 3 centuries. The Code of Ur-Nammu was inscribed on clay tablets and stone steels, and fragments of it have been discovered by archaeologists. The law code begins with a prologue, a standard feature of Mesopotamian legal texts, in which the king asserts his divine mandate and his commitment to justice. Ur-Nammu declares that he was chosen by the gods to bring order and righteousness, to protect the weak from the strong, to ensure that the widow and the orphan were not oppressed. This was not empty rhetoric. The king's role as the guarantor of justice was a central part of Mesopotamian political ideology, and a king who failed in this duty risked losing both divine favor and popular support. The laws themselves covered a wide range of topics: murder, assault, theft, property disputes, marriage, divorce, and issues of personal injury. What is particularly striking about the Code of Ur-Nammu, especially when compared to later legal codes, is its relatively humane approach to punishment. While later codes often prescribed harsh physical penalties, the lex talionis or law of retaliation, the Code of Ur-Nammu frequently relied on monetary compensation. If you injured someone, you paid them in silver according to a fixed scale. If you divorced your wife without cause, you paid her compensation. If you falsely accused someone of a crime, you were subject to the penalty that the accused would have suffered if found guilty. There were, of course, exceptions. Some crimes, particularly those involving betrayal of trust or offenses against the social order, were punished more severely. A wife who committed adultery could be put to death, though interestingly, the law was more lenient toward men. A slave who denied his master could have his mouth scoured with salt, a painful and degrading punishment. But overall, the emphasis was on restoring balance and compensating victims rather than on vengeance. The law code also reveals much about the social structure of Ur. Society was clearly stratified. There were free citizens who owned property and enjoyed full legal rights. There were dependent laborers who worked for institutions or wealthy individuals in exchange for rations and who had limited legal autonomy. And there were slaves, individuals who were considered property and who had almost no legal rights at all. A slave's life was valued less than a free person's life in the law's scale of compensation. Women in Ur occupied a complex position. They could own property, conduct business, and even engage in litigation. Wealthy women, particularly widows, could wield considerable economic power. But women were also subject to legal restrictions that men were not. A woman's sexuality was strictly controlled, and her legal identity was often subsumed under that of her father or husband. Divorce was possible, but difficult for women to initiate, and the economic consequences could be severe. Marriage in was a legal contract, arranged between families and formalized with written agreements. These contracts specified the dowry that the bride's family would provide and the bride price that the groom's family would pay. They also stipulated the terms under which the marriage could be dissolved and what would happen to property in case of divorce or death. Love might grow within a marriage, but the initial arrangement was a matter of economics and alliances, not romance. Children were valued, particularly sons, who would carry on the family name and inherit property. But childhood mortality was high, and families might have many children in the hope that some would survive to adulthood. Children were raised with a clear understanding of their place in the social hierarchy. Boys of the upper classes might be educated as scribes. Boys from craftsmen's families would learn their father's trade. Girls would be trained in the household arts, learning to spin and weave and manage a household, preparing for marriage and motherhood. The third dynasty of was also a period of extraordinary administrative sophistication. The bureaucracy of the III state was enormous, with thousands of scribes recording every detail of economic life. The archives of Urd and other cities from this period contain tens of thousands of clay tablets documenting the movement of goods, the assignment of workers, the collection of taxes, and the distribution of rations. This was a command economy in which the state, through its temple and palace institutions, controlled vast resources and directed them with meticulous precision. Workers were organized into teams and assigned specific tasks. Their productivity was monitored, and rations were adjusted based on performance. The system was efficient but also dehumanizing, reducing individuals to units of labor in a vast machine. Yet it also provided a degree of security. As long as you fulfilled your assigned duties, you were guaranteed the basic necessities of life. Trade flourished under the III dynasty. Merchants traveled to distant lands, bringing back luxury goods and raw materials. The state itself engaged in trade, sending missions to places like Dilmun, modern-day Bahrain, to acquire copper and other goods. These trade networks brought prosperity to but they also created dependencies. The city relied on imports for many essentials, from timber to metals, and disruptions to trade could have serious consequences. The military power of the III state was also formidable. Nammu and his successors maintained a professional army capable of conducting campaigns of conquest and suppressing rebellions. The army was organized along hierarchical lines, with officers drawn from the nobility and common soldiers recruited from the general population or drafted from conquered territories. The soldiers were equipped with bronze weapons and armor, and they were trained in formations and tactics that made them effective in battle. But the power of was not based solely on military might. It was also based on ideology, on the belief that the king was the representative of the gods, and that obedience to the king was a form of religious duty. This ideology was reinforced through ritual and propaganda, through festivals and hymns that celebrated the king's achievements and asserted his divine favor. The king was not just a political leader but a sacred figure, and to rebel against him was to rebel against the cosmic order itself. The reign of Nammu ended in tragedy. According to later texts, he died in battle, fighting against the Gutians, a people from the mountains to the east. His body was recovered and brought back to for burial, and his death was mourned throughout the land. But his dynasty continued, and his son Shulgi succeeded him, ruling for an astonishing 48 years, and presiding over the zenith of Ur's power and prosperity. Under Shulgi, the empire reached its greatest extent, and the administrative system was perfected. Shulgi himself was a remarkable figure, a king who claimed to be not just a warrior but also a scholar and a musician. He composed hymns to himself, extraordinary documents in which he praised his own wisdom, strength, and piety. These hymns reveal a king with an enormous ego, but they also reveal a sophisticated understanding of the power of propaganda and the importance of projecting an image of divine favor and competence. The third dynasty of represented the high point of Sumerian civilization. It was a time when the cities of southern Mesopotamia were united under a single ruler, when trade and prosperity reached levels that would not be seen again for centuries, and when the arts and sciences flourished under royal patronage. It was a time when Ur truly was the center of the world, a beacon of civilization in a landscape that was still, in many ways, wild and dangerous. But empires, even great ones, are fragile. The Ur-3 state, for all its power and sophistication, contained the seeds of its own destruction. The rigid administrative system that was its strength was also its weakness, unable to adapt to changing circumstances. The economic dependencies created by trade made the empire vulnerable to disruptions, and the surrounding peoples, envious of Ur's wealth and resentful of its dominance, waited for opportunities to strike. The golden age of Ur would not last forever, and the forces that would bring it down were already gathering on the horizon. To understand life in Ur at a human level, we must look beyond the grand narratives of kings and temples and consider the everyday experiences of ordinary people. We must enter the world of family relationships, legal disputes, and the small dramas that filled the lives of those who left no monuments but whose existence was recorded in thousands of clay tablets. The household was the fundamental unit of Mesopotamian society, and the word for household, bitum in Akkadian, meant both the physical structure of the house and the family that lived within it. A typical household consisted of a nuclear family, husband, wife, and children, though it might also include elderly parents, unmarried siblings, and perhaps a slave or two if the family was moderately prosperous. The house itself, as we have seen, was built from mud brick and organized around a central courtyard. This courtyard was the heart of domestic life, where cooking, weaving, and other household tasks took place. The rooms around the courtyard were used for sleeping and storage. Privacy, as we understand it, barely existed. Family members were constantly in each other's presence, and the boundaries between public and private life were fluid. Marriage was the foundation of the household, and it was a legal and economic arrangement as much as a personal one. When a young man and woman were to be married, their families would negotiate a contract. The groom's family would pay a bride price, called terhatum, to the bride's family, compensating them for the loss of her labor. The bride's family would provide a dowry, called sherikitu, which consisted of household goods, jewelry, and sometimes property. This dowry remained the wife's property, even after marriage, and would revert to her if she was widowed or divorced. The marriage contract was written on a clay tablet and witnessed by officials. It specified the terms of the marriage and often included clauses about what would happen in various scenarios: if the husband divorced the wife without cause, if the wife committed adultery, if the husband took a second wife. These contracts reveal a society that was deeply concerned with property rights and with maintaining social order through clearly defined legal relationships. A wife's primary duty was to manage the household and bear children, particularly sons. A woman who could not bear children was in a precarious position. The law allowed a man to take a second wife or to have children by a slave woman if his first wife was barren. However, the first wife retained her legal status, and any children born to a slave woman would typically be considered subordinate to the children of the free wife. Within the household, the husband was the legal head, but this did not mean that wives were powerless. Women could own property, and wealthy women, particularly widows, could be quite independent. There are records of women engaging in business, loaning money, and even acting as scribes, though the latter was rare. A woman who inherited property from her father, or who accumulated wealth through successful business dealings, could wield considerable influence within her family and community. Children were raised with clear expectations. Boys would learn their father's trade, or, if the family was wealthy enough, might be sent to scribal school to learn to read and write. Girls would be trained in domestic skills by their mothers. Education for girls beyond basic household management was unusual, though not unheard of. Some women, particularly those from priestly families, could become priestesses, a role that required literacy and carried considerable prestige. Discipline was strict. Parents had broad authority over their children, and disobedience was not tolerated. The law codes allowed parents to disinherit a son who was chronically rebellious, a severe punishment in a society where inheritance was the primary means of economic advancement. However, the codes also placed limits on parental authority. A son could not be disinherited without cause, and the decision had to be reviewed by the authorities to ensure it was justified. Legal disputes were a common feature of life in Ur. The clay tablets from this period are filled with records of lawsuits, arbitrations, and settlements. People sued each other over property boundaries, over unpaid debts, over broken contracts, over inheritance rights. The legal system provided a structured way to resolve these disputes without resorting to violence. Cases were typically heard by a local assembly of elders, respected men from the community who would listen to both sides and render a judgment. In more serious cases, or in cases involving parties from different cities, the matter might be referred to royal officials or even to the king himself, though this was rare. The goal was to resolve disputes quickly and fairly, to restore harmony to the community. Witnesses played a crucial role in legal proceedings. Contracts and agreements were witnessed by multiple individuals who would swear oaths confirming the validity of the transaction. If a dispute arose, these witnesses could be called to testify. Perjury was a serious offense, punishable by fines or worse, because the legal system depended on the reliability of testimony. The use of oaths was central to the legal process. A party to a dispute might be required to swear an oath by the gods, invoking divine witnesses to the truth of their statements. This was not a mere formality. In a society where the gods were believed to be actively involved in human affairs, swearing a false oath was seen as inviting divine punishment. The fear of angering the gods served as a powerful deterrent to lying. Debt was a constant concern. In an agricultural economy subject to the vagaries of weather and river flooding, crop failures were common, and farmers might need to borrow seed or food to survive until the next harvest. Debt contracts were drawn up specifying the amount borrowed, the interest rate, and the terms of repayment. Interest rates could be quite high, and borrowers who could not repay might lose their land or even be forced to sell themselves or their children into slavery. To prevent the accumulation of debt from destabilizing society, kings would occasionally declare a debt jubilee, called a misharam in Akkadian. This was a general cancellation of certain types of debts, particularly those owed by small farmers to large institutions or wealthy creditors. The jubilee did not apply to commercial debts between merchants, which were considered legitimate business transactions, but it did provide relief to those who had been forced into debt by circumstances beyond their control. These jubilees were not acts of charity, but of enlightened self-interest. A king who allowed the peasantry to be reduced to debt slavery would have no one to farm the fields or serve in the army, so periodic debt relief was a way of maintaining the economic base of the state. Slavery existed in Ur, but it was a complex institution. Slaves could be prisoners of war, individuals who had been captured in raids or battles and brought to Ur to be sold. They could also be people who had sold themselves into slavery to pay off debts, or parents who had sold their children. Slavery was not necessarily permanent. A debt slave might be freed once the debt was repaid, and children born to slaves might be manumitted by their owners. Slaves were considered property, but they were not entirely without rights. The law code specified that slaves could not be arbitrarily killed or maimed. They could own small amounts of property, and they could in some cases marry and have families, though their children would also be slaves. Some slaves were highly skilled and occupied positions of trust, managing their owners' business affairs or supervising other workers. These slaves might live relatively comfortable lives, better than some free laborers. But make no mistake, slavery was fundamentally a system of exploitation. Slaves worked long hours for minimal compensation, and their lack of freedom was a constant reality. They could be bought and sold, given as gifts, or passed down as inheritance. Their lives were entirely subject to the will of their owners, and while the law provided some protections, enforcement was often lax. The legal system of Ur, with all its complexity, was a reflection of the society's values. Justice was seen as essential to social order, and the king's role as the guarantor of justice was central to his legitimacy. But justice was not abstract or universal. It was tied to social status, and the law protected the powerful more effectively than it protected the weak. A wealthy merchant who was cheated had legal recourse and could afford to pursue it. A poor laborer who was wronged might find that the cost of justice was beyond their means. Yet for all its inequalities, the legal system of Ur represented a significant achievement. It was a system that sought to resolve disputes through established procedures rather than through violence. It was a system that recognized property rights and enforced contracts, creating the legal framework necessary for a complex economy. And it was a system that left behind a vast archive of documents. allowing us, thousands of years later, to glimpse the daily concerns and conflicts of people who lived in a world so different from our own yet recognizable in its fundamental humanity. These were people who worried about their children, who argued with their neighbors, who struggled to make ends meet, and who hoped for a better future. They lived in the shadow of great temples and under the rule of powerful kings, but their lives were shaped as much by the mundane realities of family, work, and law as by the grand movements of history. To understand we must understand these ordinary lives, for they were the foundation upon which the city's greatness was built. The relationship between the people of and the rivers that sustained them was never simple or secure. The Euphrates was a source of life, but it was also a source of danger. The river's moods were unpredictable, and its power was immense. In a single season it could shift from benefactor to destroyer, and the people of lived with this knowledge always present in their minds. The annual flood cycle was a natural feature of the Mesopotamian landscape. Each spring, as the snows melted in the mountains of Anatolia and the highlands of Armenia, water would pour into the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The rivers would swell, their levels rising dramatically, and the water would spill over the banks, inundating the fields. This was not necessarily a disaster.
In fact, it was essential.
The floodwaters deposited rich silt on the fields, renewing the soil's fertility and making agriculture possible in an otherwise difficult environment. But the timing and intensity of the floods varied from year to year. In some years, the floods came early, before the farmers had harvested their crops, and the fields would be inundated while the grain was still standing. The harvest would be ruined, and famine would threaten. In other years, the floods came late or were insufficient, and the fields would not receive enough water or silt, leading to poor harvests. And in some years, the floods came with catastrophic force, overwhelming the canals and levees that the farmers had built, destroying homes and fields and sometimes entire settlements. The archaeological record of contains evidence of such catastrophic flooding. In the 1920s, when Leonard Woolley was excavating the site, he discovered a thick layer of water-laid silt separating different levels of occupation. This silt layer was nearly 8 feet thick in some places, and it contained no artifacts, no signs of human activity. It was simply clean, fine-grained sediment, the kind that would be deposited by a major flood. Below this layer were the remains of earlier settlements, and above it were later ones. Woolley interpreted this layer as evidence of the Great Flood, the catastrophic deluge described in Mesopotamian mythology, and later in the biblical story of Noah. He believed that he had found archaeological confirmation of the flood narrative, and his discovery generated enormous publicity and excitement. The idea that a real historical event had inspired the mythological accounts was compelling, and it seemed to bridge the gap between faith and science, between ancient text and modern archaeology. However, subsequent analysis has complicated this interpretation. The silt layer that Woolley found was indeed evidence of flooding, but it appears to have been localized rather than universal. Similar silt layers have been found at other sites in southern Mesopotamia, but they do not all date to the same period. This suggests that the region experienced multiple episodes of catastrophic flooding over the centuries, rather than a single, world-destroying deluge. Nevertheless, the cultural memory of these floods was powerful. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving works of literature, contains a detailed account of a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. In this story, the hero Utnapishtim is warned by the god Ea and builds a boat to save himself, his family, and representatives of all living things. After the flood, he makes offerings to the gods, and they grant him immortality as a reward for his obedience. The parallels to the later biblical story are clear, and scholars believe that both accounts draw on older Mesopotamian flood traditions. These flood narratives served multiple purposes. On one level, they were explanations for the physical evidence that people could see the thick layers of silt, the buried ruins of earlier settlements. On another level, they were theological statements about the relationship between gods and humans. The gods sent the flood as punishment for human wickedness, or simply because humanity had become too numerous and noisy, disturbing the gods' rest. But the gods also showed mercy, allowing one righteous individual to survive and rebuild. The flood was thus both a demonstration of divine power and a reminder of divine compassion. For the people of living with the constant threat of flooding meant developing sophisticated technologies and social organizations for water management. The irrigation system of southern Mesopotamia was one of the engineering marvels of the ancient world. Networks of canals diverted water from the main river channels and distributed it across the fields. Some of these canals were many miles long, requiring careful planning and enormous labor to construct and maintain. The maintenance of the canal system was a communal responsibility. Farmers would be required to contribute labor to clean out canals, repair levees, and dig new channels as needed. This work was organized by local officials and overseen by the state. Failure to maintain the system could have catastrophic consequences, not just for individual farms but for entire regions. But the irrigation system also created problems. The constant flooding and evaporation of water left salt deposits in the soil. Over time, these salt deposits accumulated, making the land less productive. This process, called salinization, was a major environmental challenge in ancient Mesopotamia. Fields that had once produced abundant harvests would gradually become infertile, and farmers would have to abandon them and move to new land. Salinization may have been one of the factors that contributed to the eventual decline of Ur and other cities of southern Mesopotamia. As the agricultural base of these cities eroded, their populations declined, and their political and economic power waned. The cities further north, in the less salt-affected regions of central Mesopotamia, gradually gained ascendancy. Climate change also played a role. There is evidence that the climate of the region became drier during the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia BCE. Rainfall decreased, and the rivers carried less water. This made agriculture more difficult and put additional stress on the irrigation system. Droughts became more common, and crop failures more frequent. These environmental challenges were compounded by political instability. The Ur-3 Empire, for all its administrative sophistication, was overextended. It controlled a vast territory, and the costs of maintaining that control were enormous. The bureaucracy consumed vast resources, and the military campaigns needed to suppress rebellions and defend the borders were expensive in both treasure and lives. By the end of the 21st century BCE, the empire was showing signs of strain. Tax revenues were declining as agricultural productivity fell. The outlying provinces were becoming increasingly restive, and the central government's ability to enforce its will was weakening. And to the east, a new threat was emerging. The Elamites, a people from the mountains of western Iran, were organizing and growing more powerful. They had long been rivals of the Mesopotamian states, and they saw the weakening of Ur as an opportunity. The people of Ur, however, continued with their daily lives, largely unaware of the larger forces that were bearing down on their city. They farmed their fields, tended their shops, raised their children, and worshipped their gods. They believed that the gods protected Ur, that Nana Sin would watch over his city and ensure its prosperity. The ziggurat stood tall on the horizon, a constant reminder of divine presence and divine favor. How could such a city fall? But history has shown, again and again, that no city is eternal. The forces of nature and the ambitions of rival powers care nothing for the monuments that humans build or the gods they worship. The waters that gave life to Ur could also take it away. The river that had made the city possible was also the city's greatest vulnerability. And as the 3rd millennium BCE drew to a close, the waters were rising once more, not just in the literal sense of river floods, but in the metaphorical sense of political and social upheaval that would sweep away the old order and usher in a new and uncertain age. The end of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, and with it the golden age of the city, came in the year 2004 BCE. It was not a gradual decline but a sudden and catastrophic collapse brought about by a combination of external invasion and internal breakdown. The story of this fall was recorded in one of the most moving documents of ancient literature, the Lament for the Destruction of Ur, a long poem composed in the aftermath of the disaster. The immediate cause of Ur's fall was the invasion by the Elamites, a people from the mountains to the east, in what is now southwestern Iran. The Elamites had long been rivals of the Mesopotamian states, sometimes trading partners, sometimes enemies. In the final years of the Ur-3 period, they saw an opportunity. The empire was weakening, its provinces in revolt, its resources stretched thin. The Elamite king Kindachu assembled an army and marched on Ur. The last king of the 3rd dynasty was Ibisin. By all accounts, he was not a particularly effective ruler, and he presided over a state in crisis. Provinces were seceding, declaring their independence and refusing to send tribute. The irrigation system was breaking down, and agricultural productivity was falling. Food shortages were becoming common, and now, an enemy army was approaching. The Bosin attempted to defend the city, but his forces were inadequate. The professional army of the Ur-III state had been depleted by years of campaigning. The treasury was empty, and he could not afford to hire mercenaries. The people of Urd, weakened by hunger and demoralized by the collapse of the empire, could offer little resistance. The Elamites besieged Ur. They surrounded the city, cutting off supplies and waiting for starvation to do their work. Inside the city, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food ran out. People began to die. First the elderly and the very young, then the adults. The streets filled with corpses. Disease spread through the crowded neighborhoods. The great cigarette, which had always been a symbol of divine protection, now seemed to mock the suffering of the people. The lament for the destruction of Ur describes the scene in vivid and heartbreaking detail. The poem was composed as a liturgical text, to be recited in ceremonies of mourning and supplication, asking the gods to forgive whatever sins had led to this catastrophe and to restore the city to its former glory. The lament begins by describing the abandonment of the city by its divine protectors. The gods, it says, turned away from Ur. They allowed the storm of destruction to sweep over it. The poem describes the physical destruction. The walls have been breached, the gates have been burned, the ziggurat lies in ruins. It describes the human suffering. Mothers weep for their children, wives search for their husbands among the corpses, the old and the young alike lie dead in the streets. It describes the desecration of the sacred spaces. The temple of Nanna has been defiled, the offerings have been scattered, the priests have fled or been killed. But the lament is not just a catalogue of horrors. It is also a theological meditation on the nature of divine justice and the relationship between gods and humans. The poem asks why the gods allowed this to happen. It suggests that Ur must have sinned, must have offended the gods in some way, and that the destruction was a punishment. But it also expresses confusion and grief, for the people of Ur had always been faithful, had always honored the gods with offerings and hymns. Why then had the gods forsaken them? The answer offered by the lament is ultimately a mystery. The ways of the gods are inscrutable, and humans cannot fully understand their reasons. What the poem does affirm is that the gods still care about Ur, that they grieve for its destruction just as the human survivors do, and that they will eventually allow the city to be restored. The lament ends with a note of hope. May Nanna return to his city, may he take pity on his people, may the walls be rebuilt and the fields flourish once more. In historical terms, the fall of Ur marked the end of an era. The Third Dynasty, which had united southern Mesopotamia and created a powerful and prosperous state, was gone. The political center of Mesopotamia shifted northward, to cities like Isin and Lhasa, and eventually to Babylon, which would rise to become the dominant power in the region. Ur never regained its former glory. It continued to exist as a city, but it was no longer the capital of an empire. It became a provincial center, important for its religious associations, but no longer the political or economic heart of Mesopotamia. The survivors of the sack faced a grim reality. Those who had not been killed or carried off as slaves had to rebuild their lives in a ruined city. The infrastructure of the city had been destroyed. The canals were choked with debris, the fields had been trampled by armies and left untended. The temple precinct, once a bustling center of economic and religious life, was now a scene of desolation. But the people of Ur were resilient. They began the slow work of reconstruction. The canals were cleared. The fields were replanted. The temples were repaired. Though they never regained their former magnificence, life went on, in a diminished form, a shadow of what had been. The fall of Ur was also a cultural and psychological trauma. For generations, the people of southern Mesopotamia had seen Ur as a symbol of permanence and divine favor. The city had stood for millennia, had survived floods and droughts and wars. Its ziggurat had seemed eternal, a mountain of brick that could never be moved, and yet it had fallen. This realization, that even the greatest cities could be destroyed, that even the most sacred spaces could be violated, was a profound shock. The lament literature that emerged from this experience reflects this trauma. There are laments for other cities that were destroyed during this period: Nippur, Uruk, Eridu, and they all share similar themes: the abandonment by the gods, the suffering of the people, the hope for eventual restoration. These texts became part of the literary and religious tradition of Mesopotamia, copied and studied for centuries afterward. They served as reminders of the fragility of human achievement and the need for humility before the gods. The fall of Ur also had practical consequences for the development of Mesopotamian civilization. The administrative system of the Ur-III state, with its vast bureaucracy and its command economy, did not survive. The successor states adopted more decentralized forms of organization, with greater reliance on private enterprise and market mechanisms. The cultural flowering of the Ur-III period, with its literary achievements and its artistic innovations, gave way to a more fragmented cultural landscape. But the memory of Ur endured. In later Mesopotamian tradition, Ur was remembered as a great city, a place of learning and piety, the birthplace of the patriarch Abraham. The biblical narrative of Abraham's journey from Ur of the Chaldees to the land of Canaan, while historically problematic, reflects the ongoing cultural importance of the city in the ancient Near Eastern imagination. Ur was a symbol of origins, a connection to the deep past, a reminder of a time when the gods walked among men and the great cities of the plain flourished. For us, looking back across the vast expanse of time, the fall of Ur is a reminder of the impermanence of all human endeavors. The ziggurat, built to last forever, is now a ruin. The palaces and temples, once filled with life and activity, are mounds of dust. The people who walked those streets, who worshipped in those temples, who made their living in that bustling marketplace, are long dead, their names forgotten, except for a few preserved on clay tablets. And yet something of Ur remains. We can still walk among the ruins, still see the outlines of the ancient streets, still trace the foundations of the ziggurat. We can read the tablets that record the thoughts and deeds of the people who lived there. We can, with effort and imagination, reconstruct something of their lives and their world. In this way, Ur lives on, not as a physical city but as an idea, a window into the distant past, a reminder of where we came from and what we have built and lost and built again. For more than 3,000 years, the city of Ur lay buried beneath the sands of southern Iraq. The wind and rain gradually wore down the ancient mud brick structures, and the desert reclaimed the land. The canals silted up and disappeared. The fields returned to wilderness. Local people knew that there was something beneath the sand, a tell or mound that stood higher than the surrounding plain, and they knew that this place was old, but the details of its history were lost. In the 19th century, European travelers and archaeologists began to explore Mesopotamia, drawn by the biblical accounts and by a growing interest in the ancient civilizations of the Near East. They identified various sites with cities mentioned in ancient texts, and they began to excavate, uncovering temples and palaces and libraries filled with clay tablets. The site of Ur was identified in the mid-19th century, and preliminary excavations were conducted, but the major work did not begin until the 1920s. A joint expedition sponsored by the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, led by the British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley, undertook a systematic excavation of the site. Woolley and his team worked at Ur for 12 seasons, from 1922 to 1934, and what they discovered astonished the world. Woolley was a meticulous and innovative archaeologist. He used careful stratigraphic methods to document the layers of occupation at the site, and he employed teams of local workers to sift through the soil, recovering even the smallest artifacts. His most famous discovery was the Royal Cemetery, which we have already discussed, with its extraordinary grave goods and evidence of human sacrifice. The treasures from the Royal Cemetery, including the golden headdress of Queen Puabi and the famous lyre with its bull's head, became iconic images of ancient Mesopotamia. But Woolley's excavations also revealed much about the daily life of the city. He uncovered residential neighborhoods, with streets and houses that allowed scholars to reconstruct the layout of the ancient city. He excavated workshops and found the tools and materials used by ancient craftsmen. He discovered the ziggurat, or at least what remained of it, and was able to reconstruct its original appearance based on the surviving foundations and fragments. Woolley also found the thick silt layer that he interpreted as evidence of the Great Flood. This discovery generated enormous publicity as it seemed to provide archaeological confirmation of the biblical narrative. Newspapers around the world ran stories about the discovery of Noah's flood, and Woolley became famous. However, as we have noted, Later analysis has complicated this interpretation, suggesting that the silt layer was evidence of localized flooding rather than a universal deluge. The excavations at Ur provided scholars with a wealth of information about early Mesopotamian civilization. The thousands of clay tablets recovered from the site documented the administrative, legal, and economic life of the city. They revealed the complexity of the Ur III state and provided insights into everything from agricultural production to temple rituals. The tablets also included literary texts, hymns, myths, and laments, which allowed scholars to reconstruct something of the religious and intellectual life of the ancient city. The artifacts from Ur were distributed among the sponsoring institutions, and today they can be found in museums around the world. The British Museum in London houses many of the most important pieces, including the famous Standard of Ur, a beautifully inlaid box depicting scenes of war and peace. The University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia also has significant collections, and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, despite suffering greatly during the wars and instability of recent decades, still holds many artifacts from the site. The legacy of Ur extends beyond the museum cases. The city's influence on later civilizations was profound. The administrative techniques developed at Ur, including the use of written records to track economic transactions, became standard practice throughout Mesopotamia and influenced later empires. The legal traditions exemplified in the Code of Ur-Nammu contributed to the development of the more famous Code of Hammurabi and through it, to the broader legal traditions of the ancient Near East. The religious traditions of Ur also had a lasting impact. The worship of Nana-Sin continued for centuries after the fall of the Third Dynasty. The moon god remained an important deity in the Mesopotamian pantheon, and his temple at Ur continued to be a site of pilgrimage and worship. The theological ideas developed at Ur, about the relationship between gods and humans, about the role of the king as intermediary between the divine and earthly realms, about the importance of ritual and offering, influenced the religious thought of the entire region. Perhaps most intriguingly, Ur is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as the birthplace of Abraham, the patriarch of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. According to the biblical narrative, Abraham was born in Ur of the Chaldees and was called by God to leave his homeland and journey to Canaan. The historical accuracy of this account is debated by scholars. The biblical Ur is said to be in Chaldea, which suggests a later identification with a Babylonian context, and there are chronological problems with the traditional dating. But whether or not the biblical Abraham was a historical figure from Ur, the association between the city and the patriarch reflects the importance of Ur in the cultural memory of the ancient world. Today the site of Ur is located in modern Iraq, in the Dakhar Governorate, near the city of Nasiriyah. The ziggurat has been partially reconstructed, and visitors can climb its ancient steps and stand where the priests of Nana-Sin once stood, looking out over a landscape that is both the same and utterly transformed. The Euphrates River, which once flowed past the city, has changed its course over the millennia, and today it runs several miles to the east. The fields that once fed the city are now largely desert, though there are efforts to revive agriculture in the region. The site has suffered in recent decades. During the wars in Iraq, the area around Ur saw military activity, and the site itself was used as a military base by coalition forces during the 2003 invasion. This caused some damage, though less than might have been feared. In the years since, there have been efforts to preserve and protect the site, but resources are limited, and the political situation remains unstable. Nevertheless, Ur endures. It endures as a physical place where the ruins of the ancient city still stand, weathered but not entirely erased. It endures in the artifacts scattered in museums around the world, tangible connections to a distant past, and it endures in the human imagination, as a symbol of the birth of civilization, a reminder of what humans can achieve when they come together to build cities, to create art, to develop laws and knowledge and culture. The story of Ur is, in many ways, the story of human civilization itself. It is a story of adaptation and innovation, of people learning to live in a challenging environment by developing new technologies and new forms of social organization. It is a story of ambition and achievement, of the creation of monumental architecture and sophisticated art, of the development of writing and law and trade. It is a story of faith and ritual, of people seeking to understand their place in the cosmos and to establish relationships with the divine powers they believed governed their lives. But it is also a story of fragility and loss. It reminds us that even the greatest cities can fall, that even the most powerful states can collapse. It reminds us that the environment can be both a resource and a threat, and that human activities can have unintended consequences that accumulate over time. And it reminds us that nothing is permanent, that all human achievements are ultimately transitory, subject to the relentless forces of nature and history. Yet there is something deeply moving in the persistence of Ur's memory. The people who built that city are gone, but their legacy remains. We can still read their words, still admire their craftsmanship, still wonder at their achievements. In studying Urs, we are not just learning about the past, we are connecting with our ancestors, with the people who first walked the path that we still follow, the path from village to city, from tribe to state, from oral tradition to written history. Ur was one of the first cities, and in its rise and fall, we can see patterns that have been repeated countless times throughout history. But Ur was also unique, a product of its particular time and place, shaped by the rivers and deserts of southern Mesopotamia, by the theology and cosmology of Sumerian religion, by the political and economic structures of the early Bronze Age. To understand Ur is to understand something essential about the human experience, about our capacity for both creation and destruction, about our eternal quest for meaning and permanence, in a world that offers neither. And so we come to the end of our journey through the ancient city of Ur. We have walked its streets in the cool of the morning, felt the heat of the midday sun on mud brick walls, heard the calls of vendors in the marketplace, and smelled the incense burning in the great temple of Nana Sin. We have witnessed the daily work of the city, the grinding of grain and the shaping of pottery, the spinning of wool and the inscribing of clay tablets. We have seen the splendor of the ziggurat, rising in three great terraces toward the sky, a mountain of brick and faith in a land without mountains. We have explored the complexities of law and family, the negotiations of marriage contracts, the resolution of disputes, the bonds of loyalty and duty that held society together. We have descended into the royal tombs and confronted the mystery of the death pits, those haunting arrangements of bodies that speak to beliefs and practices we can barely comprehend. We have celebrated the achievements of the Third Dynasty, the law code of Ur-Nammu, the administrative sophistication of the Earth-a-Free State, the cultural flowering that made this period a golden age. And we have mourned the fall of the city, the invasion of the Elamites, the sack and destruction, the lament that rose from the ruins. We have followed the city through its long decline and its eventual rediscovery as archaeologists in the 20th century uncovered its secrets and brought them back into the light. The city of Ur, 5,000 years ago, was one of the first great urban centers in human history. It was a place where writing was still new, where the wheel had only recently been invented, where the very concept of civilization was taking shape. The people who lived there were pioneers, creating something that had never existed before, building a society of unprecedented complexity and scale. They did not know that they were making history. They were simply living their lives, trying to survive and prosper, honoring their gods, raising their families, pursuing their trades. But they were also conscious of living in a special time and place. They knew that Ur was not an ordinary city but a sacred city, the dwelling place of Nana Sin, the moon god. They believed that their city was favored by the gods, that it would endure forever. And in a sense they were right. Though the physical city fell, though its buildings crumbled and its people scattered, the idea of Ur persisted. It persisted in the memory of later generations, in the texts that recorded its history, in the artifacts that bore witness to its achievements. For us, looking back across the vast gulf of time, Ur is a window into the origins of civilization. It shows us what humans are capable of when we work together, when we pool our resources and our knowledge, when we commit ourselves to building something larger than ourselves. It shows us the power of religion to inspire and unite, the importance of law and justice to social order, the centrality of trade and economic exchange to urban life. It shows us the beauty that can be created through art and craftsmanship, the knowledge that can be preserved through writing. But Ur also shows us the darker side of civilization. It shows us the social hierarchies and inequalities that arise when societies become complex, the way that some people gain power and wealth while others are reduced to dependence or slavery. It shows us the environmental consequences of intensive agriculture and urban growth, the way that human activities can degrade the land and make it less able to support future generations. And it shows us the fragility of even the most powerful states, the way that internal weaknesses and external threats can combine to bring about collapse. Perhaps most importantly, reminds Retrium Continuous of the impermanence of all things. The ziggurat that seemed eternal is now a ruin. The canals that brought water to the fields are buried beneath the sand. The voices that once filled the marketplace are silent. The gods who were worshipped with such devotion are no longer invoked. The very language in which the people of Ur spoke and wrote, Sumerian, has been dead for thousands of years, preserved only in scholarly texts and ancient inscriptions. And yet, something remains. The tablets that recorded the thoughts and deeds of the people of Ur can still be read. The artifacts they created can still be admired. The foundations of the buildings they constructed can still be traced, and the stories of their lives, reconstructed from these fragmentary remains, can still move us, can still teach us, can still connect us to our shared human past. The floods that threatened Ur, both the literal floods of the Euphrates and the metaphorical floods of invasion and collapse, did not completely erase the city. They covered it, buried it, transformed it, but they did not destroy it entirely. And in the modern era, as archaeologists have carefully removed the layers of accumulated debris, the city has emerged once more, not as a living community, but as a testament to human achievement and human vulnerability. We live in a world that would be unimaginable to the people of ancient Ur. Our technologies are vastly more sophisticated. Our understanding of the natural world is incomparably deeper. Our societies are organized on principles that would seem strange or even incomprehensible to them. And yet, in fundamental ways, we are not so different. We still build cities seeking security and prosperity in urban life. We still create laws and institutions to govern our relationships with one another. We still engage in trade, connecting distant places through networks of exchange. We still create art and literature seeking to express beauty and meaning. We still grapple with questions of justice and fairness, trying to balance the competing claims of individuals and communities. And we still face environmental challenges, trying to live sustainably on a planet with limited resources. The story of Ur, then, is not just ancient history. It is a story that continues to resonate, that offers lessons and warnings for our own time. It reminds us that civilizations are built through collective effort, and that they depend on the cooperation of many individuals working toward common goals. It reminds us that environmental sustainability is not a modern concern, but a challenge that has faced every agricultural society throughout history. It reminds us that legal and political institutions are essential to social stability and that they require constant maintenance and adaptation to changing circumstances. And it reminds us that nothing we build is guaranteed to last, that all human achievements are subject to the forces of nature and history. But the story of Ur also offers hope. It shows us that even after catastrophic collapse, recovery is possible. After the fall of the Third Dynasty, Ur continued to exist. It was rebuilt, reoccupied, and remained an important city for many centuries. The ziggurat was repaired and continued to serve as a place of worship. The fields were replanted and continued to produce harvests. Life went on, different from before, but still recognizably continuous with the past. And even after Ur finally was abandoned, after the last inhabitants departed and the desert began to reclaim the ruins, the city's legacy endured. Its influence shaped the civilizations that came after. Its memory was preserved in texts and traditions, and ultimately, through the patient work of archaeologists, its physical remains were recovered and its story was told again to new audiences in new times. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let your mind wander back to those ancient streets. Imagine the cool dawn air, the calls of merchants opening their stalls, the smell of fresh bread baking in clay ovens. Imagine the sight of the great ziggurat, its 3 terraces rising toward the heavens, painted in black and red and gleaming white. Imagine the sound of hymns being chanted in the temple, the music of lyres and drums, the prayers offered to Nana Sin, the moon god who measured time with his monthly journey across the night sky. Imagine the people of Ur going about their daily lives, unaware that they were living at the dawn of civilization, that their city would be remembered for thousands of years, that their names would be studied by scholars in distant lands, that their artifacts would be preserved in museums they could never have conceived of. They were simply living, working, loving, worshipping, hoping for good harvests and peaceful times. trying to make sense of their place in a vast and mysterious cosmos. And in that, they were like us. For we too are simply living our lives, going about our daily business, mostly unaware of how our time will be remembered by future generations, if it is remembered at all. We too build our cities and create our laws and worship our gods or pursue our values. We too hope that what we build will endure, even as we dimly understand that nothing is truly permanent. The waters that once threatened have long since found new channels. The floods that buried parts of the city have receded, and the archaeologists have uncovered what was hidden. The Great Ziggurat still stands, or at least its foundations and lower terraces remain, reconstructed in part, a monument to human ambition and divine devotion. The site is quiet now, visited by occasional tourists and pilgrims, watched over by guards who protect it from looters and vandals, slowly weathering in the desert sun. But in our imagination, lives again. We can walk its streets, enter its houses, climb the steps of the ziggurat, stand in the marketplace and watch the bustle of trade. We can meet its people, hear their voices, understand their concerns and aspirations. We can appreciate their achievements and learn from their mistakes. We can honor their memory and acknowledge our debt to them, for they were among the first to walk the path that we still follow, the path from scattered villages to great cities, from oral tradition to written history, from isolated communities to interconnected civilizations. The story of is a story of water and earth, of rivers and floods, of mud bricks and reed boats, of canals and fields. It is a story of gods and kings, of priests and merchants, of scribes and craftsmen. It is a story of law and justice, of marriage and family, of work and worship. It is a story of ambition and achievement, of rise and fall, of creation and destruction. It is a story of humanity in all its complexity, its nobility and its cruelty, its wisdom and its folly. And now, as our journey through this ancient world comes to its end, it is time to return to the present, to the comfortable room where you lie, to the soft pillow beneath your head, to the gentle rhythm of your breathing. The distant past fades like a dream, but it is not entirely gone. Something of remains with you, a sense of connection to those who came before, an appreciation for the long arc of human history, a recognition that we are all part of a story that began long ago and continues still. Rest now and let the images of the ancient city drift through your mind. The morning light on mud brick walls, the shimmer of the river in the distance, the sound of children playing in narrow streets, the sight of the moon rising over the ziggurat, pale and perfect, the visible manifestation of the God who watches over all. Let these images bring you peace, and let the story of remind you that humans have always strived, have always built, have always sought meaning and beauty in a world that offers both wonder and hardship. The city of before the floods came was a marvel of its age, a testament to human ingenuity and divine favor. The floods came, as floods always do, but they did not erase what had been created. The water receded, the silt settled, and life continued. New cities were built on the foundations of the old. New generations learned from the achievements and mistakes of their ancestors. The great wheel of history turned, bringing change and continuity, loss and recovery, endings and new beginnings. And so our story fades, but the echoes of this world remain. Until next time, rest well. Thank you for joining me tonight. Our voyage through the past comes to an end. Sleep well and dream of distant ages.